Om Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsachanuramaddanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishno Vande Jagadgurum. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Welcome to our ongoing class on Bhagavad Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. This is class number 19. Our next class is on Sunday, 26th of May at 9:30 a.m. The next assignment is to read the next chapter of Essays on the Gita by Sri Aurobindo, chapter 10, called The Yoga of the Intelligent Will, aka Karma Yoga. And just read or reread verses 2.40 to 2.72. So verses 40 to 72 of the Bhagavad Gita itself, along with chapter 10 of Sri Aurobindo's Essays on the Gita, The Yoga of the Intelligent Will. He'll be talking about those verses in this chapter. One handy little pro tip, which I learned from Himaja a few weeks ago actually. I didn't know this. In our Gita app on our phone, if you go to, they have the entire text of the Essays on the Gita. And they actually add verse references to the Gita in the body of the text. It's not perfect, to be honest, but certainly better than nothing. It's not bad. It misses a lot of references, as far as I can tell, but it gets some of them too. So what you can do is, if you're burning to know what's the verse reference, you can look it up on the app, and you may very well find the verse reference in the Gita app. Okay? If you have trouble finding it, just let me know. It's under, you click on the hamburger menu thing, and you go to Gita. Sri Aurobindo and the Gita is like a separate category. You click on that, and the first link is Essays. Category is Essays. You hit Essays. That's Essays on the Gita, and it has the entire text. And in the menu, it has every chapter. So you just click on the chapter you want, and then you find it. Okay, so it's kind of cool. Not perfect, as I said. It misses a lot of references, but it's still much better than nothing, and it does have a lot of references. What we're going to do today, as always, we're pressed for time with this. 1 hour is just a little, ideally it would be 1.5 hours, but anyway. What we'll do is, we're going to go through verses 39 to 44, hopefully, of the Gita. And then we are going to go through chapter 9, which was today's. We'll be discussing chapter 9, Samkhya, Yoga, and Vedanta, from Essays on the Gita. It's a very difficult chapter. I found this arguably to be maybe the hardest chapter so far. Did you guys find it difficult, chapter 9?
No.
Nobody wants to say it? You didn't find it. Bala, it's a piece of cake for Bala.
I think I'm getting hang of his chapter.
Huh?
Getting hang of his style and everything.
Right. Okay, good.
Better.
I found it very challenging. Part of the reason is, well, we'll get to this in a second when we get to. Let's start with verses. So let's open the app and open to verse 2.39. I know that we discussed it last time. I'm just going to summarize quickly. Okay. So 2.39. Remember, Krishna is telling Arjuna, what I just told you in the past few verses was all from the standpoint of Samkhya Buddhi. I've taught you Samkhya Buddhi, the intelligence based on Samkhya philosophy. And what's the main teaching? That you are not the body, you are not even the mind, you are the eternal Atman, the eternal soul, separate from the body-mind complex. Okay. Then Krishna says, now let me teach you Buddhi based on karma, otherwise known as Buddhi Yoga. It's another kind of Buddhi. Buddhi in the sense of intelligence. But this is how you can intelligently live in the world and navigate the world, continuing to act in the world, but in a spiritual way, with a spiritual attitude. Okay? And then you get this next verse, 40. So let's start with 40. Please open to 2.40.
So,
Mm-hmm.
one question about 39.
Mm-hmm.
In some translations, I've seen that it's the buddhi is described as just for the buddhi yoga.
I know, but what is buddhi yoga? So here, it just even grammatically, buddhi is in the nominative case, which means buddhi is, there are two kinds of buddhi. Krishna says, I just taught you buddhi based on Samkhya, and now I'm just explaining grammatically. And now I'm going to teach you buddhi based on yoga. He says yoga. What that means in this context is karma yoga. It becomes clear because, yeah. So, verse 40. Please repeat after me. Neha bhikramana shosti pratyavayo na vidyate svalpam apyasya dharmasya trayate mahato bhayat. If you don't have, do you have a Gītā text?
Yeah.
Oh, you do? Okay. Do you need one? Or there's one, we have extra ones in the bookshelf there, so just you can,
Okay.
yeah. Chit Bhavananda's Gītā. Iha, here, abhikramanashaha na asti. There is no wasted effort. No effort is lost on the spiritual path. Pratyavayaha na vidyate. There are no sort of fatal obstacles. There are going to be obstacles and challenges in spiritual life, as all of us know, as spiritual aspirants. So Krishna is not saying it's a path of roses. But none of these obstacles are fatal. And ultimately, every one of us will attain the highest goal. Asya dharmasya swalpamapi mahataha bhayatat trayate. Even a little bit of this dharma that I'm teaching you, these spiritual teachings, will save you from the mahat bhayam, great fear. What is that great fear? There are slight differences among the commentators. Sri Aurobindo takes it to be a fear of sin, fear of suffering, fear of death, anxiety about death, these kinds of things.
Fear of narg.
Fear of?
Narg. Hell.
Narak. Okay. Yeah. Yes. So many kinds of fear. And Tapasyananda helpfully points out that in what sense is there no wasted effort? Well, because of rebirth and karma. So whatever effort we make in this life towards spiritual progress, if we don't attain the highest goal, which is liberation, it's not like all our effort is wasted. It's a bank account. We have our savings. In our next life, we come with that savings, that karmic savings, and we continue where we left off in the previous life. Right? 41. Now we get what seems to be something of a non sequitur, but it's actually not. So please repeat after me. Vyavasayatmika buddhihi ekeha kurunandana bahushakha hyanantascha buddhayo avyavasayinam. Hey Kurunandana, O Arjuna, iha, here, vyavasaya atmika buddhihi. Here there's a mistake in the anvaya. The end of the sentence marker should be after the word eka. It's one word before it should. The end of the sentence is shown as after buddhihi. It should be after eka, the next word. It makes it really confusing. So, this vyavasaya atmika buddhihi, this fixed and resolute intelligence is eka, is one. One-pointed, single. Okay. Avyavasayanam buddhayaha hi bahushaka anantascha. But the avyavasayanam, so the opposite kind of buddhi, those who have a many-branching and multifarious intelligence, chasing after this and that desire or worldly pleasure, or these kinds of things, is many-branched, bahushaka, and anantash, and it's infinite. And the mind is always restless and never satisfied. Okay. Now, how is this related to the previous verses? The key word buddhi in 39. Remember, there's buddhi in 39. Krishna is saying, I'm teaching you two kinds of buddhi. One is based on Samkhya, the other is based on karma yoga. 41 picks up the same term and explains that there are two kinds of buddhi. So Tapasyananda, I think, very helpfully says here, let me read you his commentary on verse 41. He says, this verse gives the contrast between one who wholeheartedly follows the spiritual path So it could be either based on Samkhya Buddhi or on Karma Yoga, the Buddhi of Karma Yoga, either, because they're both spiritual paths. And a worldly minded man who follows wealth, sensual satisfaction, and ambition. A man who has a spiritual worldview, a firm faith in a divine intelligence based on the instruction of the scripture and the guru, has got a fixed goal that does not vary. He is like a man who has a correct idea of the destination and has selected the correct road to it. He is therefore at peace, knowing that he is on the right road. A worldly minded man, on the other hand, may not often have a fixed worldview. He cares only for gains, enjoyments, and pursuit of ambitions. So without any conviction about the nature of the universe and his own destiny in it, he pursues these diverse satisfactions, the objects of which change from time to time. Hence, the understanding of such a person gets many-branched, being engaged in the pursuit of several ends. His mental energies are thus dissipated, and he loses control of the mind and becomes a slave of the senses and their objects. I think this is a very nice contrast between these two kinds of buddhi. One is spiritual, the other is worldly. And this also provides a perfect segue into the subsequent 3 verses, which are a little surprising in the context of the Gita. Krishna is loving an avatar, a god, and he comes down pretty hard on what he calls Vedavada. So we're going to read all 3 of these verses together because they kind of go hand in hand, almost grammatically too. Yamimam pushpitam vacham pravadanti avipaschitaha vedavadarataha partha nanyat astiti vadinaha. 2.43 Kamatmanaha Svargapara Janma Karma Phalapradam Kriya Vishesha Bahulam Bhogaishvarya Gatim Prati Bhogaishvarya. This is 2.44, sorry. Bhogaishvarya Prasaktanam Taya Pahrita Chetasam Vyavasayatmika Buddhihi Samadho Navidhiyate. Good. So see how the anvaya here is massive? It's a whole paragraph because it's an anvaya of all 3 of these verses together. 42, 43, and 44. He Partha, O Arjuna, Kamatmanaha. Those who are full of desires, whose selves are full of kama. Veda Vadarataha. Those who are Vedic fundamentalists, who are obsessed with every letter, every word of the Vedas in a very literal fundamentalist sense. Svargaparaha, intent on going to Svarga, these temporary heavens where they can enjoy themselves. You can call them spiritual hedonists. We'll get to this in a second. How is all this relevant now? Krishna comes down really hard on followers of Vedic ritualism, basically. And they're defunct now, more or less. How is it relevant to us now? We'll get to that. Na anyat asti iti vadinaha. This is really important. Na anyat asti iti vadinaha. There's nothing else apart from what is talked about in these Vedas. So that's what is meant by Vedic fundamentalism. These are fundamentalists. This is true of any fundamentalists of all religions. They think that their scripture alone has a monopoly on the truth and nothing else exists or is worthwhile. Avipaschitaha. Those people with wavering minds who don't have true discernment, whose minds are befuddled. Bhoga Aishvarya Gatim Prati. They aim for bhoga, enjoyment, worldly enjoyments, and not necessarily even just world, but even enjoyments in these higher realms, these temporary heavens. But it's still a kind of higher form of hedonism at the end of the day. And Aishvarya, glory, different kinds of glory that you get, name and fame and these kinds of things. Kriya Vishesha Bahulam. Sorry, I don't know why. Kriya Vishesha Bahulam. the sacrifices, the Vedic sacrifices that they perform are full of very intricate rules and steps and complicated rites and things like that, which they have to follow exactly to the letter. That's part of their fundamentalist mindset. Janma karma phala pradam. What's the result of all of these Vedic sacrifices? Rebirth again and again, and they're never able to escape from this karmic cycle either. You can't transcend karma by engaging in these Vedic sacrifices with desires for worldly ends. Yamimam pushpitam vacham. So it's almost sarcastic. Krishna here, pravadanti. They speak flowery words. He's being really scathing here. Taya aparita chetasam. And these people with clouded intellects, bhoga aishvarya prasaktanam, who are attached to worldly enjoyments into glory, vyavasaya atmika buddhihi samadhana vidiyate. Remember the vyavasaya atmika from verse 41? This verse in verse 44 picks up exactly the same term. So I hope you see the connecting link now between the verses. But what's being said is that vyavasaya atmika buddhi, that one-pointed intelligence of spiritual aspirants, is not present among these people who blindly follow these Vedic rituals and are only after worldly enjoyments. So this is how verses 42 through 44 connect with the previous verses. The idea is, Krishna says, I've just explained to you Samkhya Buddhi. I'm going to teach you soon the Buddhi based on Karma Yoga. But before that, let me tell you what you should avoid. This Vedic ritualism, this Vedic fundamentalism, which is a recipe for having an avyavasaya atmika buddhi, for having a mind that becomes scattered across 100 different desires and ambitions. This is what you don't want. Do you see? So it's a kind of interlude in this chapter. And it's very scathing. And you might ask, how is this relevant to us now? In 2024, we can think about it this way. What Krishna is attacking so scathingly is any form of spiritual hedonism. Any form of spiritual hedonism. Any attempt to justify bhoga in the name of yoga. Bhoga means worldly enjoyment. Yoga means spiritual practice. And this is very common. In fact, it's becoming, spirituality is kind of trending now. And so this is very common. Either you get spirituality through drugs, or people promise, a better worldly life through spirituality. All these things, be wary of all of these different advertising campaigns and all these other things. In fact, Katha Upanishad talks about two different paths that confront every human being. The path of Shreya and the path of Preya. And wise people choose the path of Shreya, which is the path of perfection, spiritual perfection. Stupid people, this is literally the word used actually, manda, people who are manda, have manda buddhis. They choose the path of Preya. Stupid in a spiritual sense. I mean, they're ultimately inflicting harm on themselves. Stupid in the sense that you choose the path which in the long run is going to be worse for you. That's in that sense. They choose the path of Preya. And Shankara in his commentary on this verse, on this mantra in Katha Upanishad, says something really helpful. He says, most people confuse these two paths. They mistake the path of Preya for the path of Shreya. They mistake Preya for Shreya. They think they're going on the spiritual path, but in fact they're going on the exact opposite path, the worldly path. So the first step in spiritual life is clearly distinguishing between Preya and Shreya, between Bhoga and Yoga, and not mixing up the two. And so I think part of the reason why Bhagavan Krishna comes down so hard on these Vedic fundamentalists is because in the name of a religious scripture, the Vedas, the highest scripture, and doing sacrifices, which is also a good thing in a way, they're actually they're just indulging in a higher form of hedonism. We can call it a spiritual hedonism. Okay. So I think it still is relevant actually. So now let's start discussing chapter 9 of Sri Aurobindo's essays on the Gītā. I wrote on the board the structure of this chapter. I really found this to be a challenging chapter. And I hope this outline of the structure of the chapter helps to explain why it's so difficult. Most commentaries on the Gītā, they go verse by verse. And he is going all the way from chapter 2 down to chapter 15 and drawing on different verses of different chapters throughout this chapter. And for people who are only reading this text for the first time and people who have not read the entire Gītā, it can be totally bewildering. So I've given the verse. So this is my understanding of the structure, and each of us can have a different understanding. The bare bones structure or outline of this chapter. It starts with a discussion of Arjuna's puzzlement about the precise relationship between Samkhya and yoga. In fact, it comes twice. Arjuna asks a number of questions in the Bhagavad Gita. At the beginning of chapter 3, Arjuna asks a question in chapter 2. That'll come up later in chapter 2. But in chapter 3, it begins with a question. You are confusing me, O Krishna. Because you're talking very highly of Samkhya, and then at the same time, but Samkhya teaches renunciation of works. And at the same time, you're teaching Karma Yoga that I should fight in this deadly war. Which one is it? Pick a lane. Which one, which is better? One of them seems to be, you seem to be saying that Samkhya is better than Karma Yoga, then why should I be fighting in the war? Krishna gives another answer in chapter 3 and in chapter 4. Arjuna's not satisfied, still confused. So again in chapter 5, he begins by saying, you're still confusing me, O Krishna. And he asks more or less the same question again. And then Krishna gives another answer. So that's what Sri Aurobindo talks about in the first part of chapter 9, even though we haven't even got to these verses yet, or these chapters in the Gita. Do you see what I mean? So it's already kind of confusing for people who are not familiar with the broader Gita. 3.1 to 9 and 5.1 to 6. And we're not going to talk about all these verses now because we'll get to that when we actually talk about the chapters. Then, number 2, comes a discussion of Karmakanda, otherwise known as Vedavada. That's the term used in the Gita actually, Vedavada Rataha. These are Vedic fundamentalists who are obsessed with following every letter to the T of the Vedas. Versus the Jnanakanda, the knowledge portion of the Vedas. We talked about this long back in like one of the earliest classes. What is the Jnanakanda? The Upanishads. Yeah, very good. Yeah. The Upanishads, a little bit more broadly, Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, and Brahma Sutra. Okay. And this is called Brahmavada. At least Sri Aurobindo calls it that. Okay. So Brahmavada versus Karmakanda. How does the Gita reconcile Karmakanda with the Jnanakanda or Brahmavada? And he discusses that in relation to verses 2.42 to 46, which we've just discussed, and chapters 3, 4, and 9. I mean, he's really going broad here. He's linking it to many other things because why? Karmakanda is all about sacrifice, doing Vedic sacrifices, often literal animal sacrifices. And it gives exact instructions as to how to do it, who is to do it. The Brahmin priest has to be accompanied by his wife and follow these rules with the aim of what? Going to heaven, enjoying here and enjoying hereafter in a heaven. And then you come back again. And there's no liberation. Okay? So you go, and that's life. Okay. But Sri Aurobindo says, what does the Gita do? He'll say, look, the Gita, even if it comes down hard, scathingly, on Vedic fundamentalism, Vedic ritualism, in these verses that we just read, it can't be purely a negative attitude because that's not the overall thrust of the Gita. So that it has to accept something from it. What does it accept? It accepts the basic idea of sacrifice, the concept of sacrifice. Many of you, this is one of the study questions, and all of you got that right as far as I can tell. It accepts sacrifice, but it does a couple things. Number one, it broadens the concept of sacrifice to include all actions. Swamiji has a very moving speech on sannyasa, where he talks about how a sannyasi has to sacrifice everything, including himself. And literally everything becomes a sacrifice. That's also why we chant Brahmarpanam before meals. Even eating is a sacrifice. Everything should be a sacrifice. And secondly, the second key difference between Karmakanda and the Vedanta of the Gita is the Karmakanda, the Vedavadins, they have certain worldly desires. They do these sacrifices with worldly aims. They want to enjoy. That's why I call it a spiritual hedonism. Right? Krishna says, do those sacrifices, but in a nishkama way, without desires. Then it becomes karma yoga. Anything you do can be a sacrifice if you do it, if you take the ego out of it, if you take desire out of it. Okay? So that's only the second part of this chapter. And why does he talk about 3, 4, and 9? 3 and 4 especially, because chapters 3 and 4 talk about sacrifice. Yajna is the Sanskrit term, at length. And chapter 4 has this very beautiful series of verses about many different kinds of sacrifice in a symbolic way. Self-control is a form of sacrifice. Study of the scriptures is another form of sacrifice. I mean, there are many different kinds of sacrifice. you see. So it's broadening and expanding the idea of sacrifice that's already present in the Karmakanda, the Vedavada, but giving it a more spiritual interpretation and a broader interpretation. Okay. Third part of chapter 9. Sri Aurobindo, this is, I think, the most difficult. And I want us to close read the relevant paragraph here. He's contrasting what he calls the orthodox Vedanta of the time of the Gita, at the time that the Gita was composed, with the Bhagavad Gita's own Vedantic philosophy of the Purushottama. We've already talked about the Purushottama several times. Last time I gave you a chart explaining the non-dual Vedantic philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita, and at the top you get the infinite divine Purushottama. I suggest that you have a folder, like I have a folder now, because there are going to be multiple handouts. I might refer to them in future classes. So bring the folder with the handouts. And if any of you didn't get the handout last time, I have 2 more copies of it here. Why don't you, can you just give them to a couple people that don't have it? Yeah. Okay, so we're going to end here in this third part of chapter 9. Sri Aurobindo talks about chapters 7 and 15 of the Bhagavad Gita, because the concept of Purushottama doesn't come until chapter 15. And chapter 7 is important, and chapter 15, because it explains the jiva, and the jiva, the individual soul's relationship to the Purushottama, the highest divine reality. In chapter 15, we're told, Mamevamsho jiva loke jiva bhuta sanatana, which is that each jiva, each individual soul, is a real manifestation of, a real part of the one infinite divine Purushottama. Why is chapter 7 relevant? Because chapter 7 makes a very important distinction between 2 kinds of prakriti. Apara prakriti, the lower prakriti, or inferior prakriti, and the para prakriti, the supreme prakriti. Okay? So, that's the third part, but not the final part of chapter 9. And then at the end, he throws in a very interesting, and I think moving discussion of the role of scripture in spiritual life, the study of scripture. So what is the Bhagavad Gita's attitude toward scriptural study? And this is in relation to 2.46 and 2.52 to 53, which we are not going to read today, but we'll get to that shortly in a subsequent class. But you see, part of the reason why the chapter is so challenging is because it spans from chapter 2 all the way up to chapter 15, referencing different verses in these different future chapters which we haven't even read yet. So unless you're like me and you've read the Gita many times, and I've read this now, I don't know, 4 or 5 times, it's very hard to follow everything that's going on. So do your best. And, you can come back, you can revisit the chapter later. So now, I wanted to actually, I'm not going to go through the study questions ploddingly here, but I wanted to mention. So, study question number 1. According to Sri Aurobindo, how does the Gita conceive the concept of Maya? I think most of you did a good job on this. Bala gave a nice succinct answer. He says, Maya was used very little in the Gita as compared to Prakriti. Gita talks about 2 levels of Prakriti. Apara, lower, the changing world of matter, and para, higher, the changeless jiva. Here, though, I would say para prakriti actually would be, I would say, Shakti itself. Remember in the chart? Mm-hmm. It's Shakti para prakriti, supreme nature, 7.5, which manifests as the jiva. So I wouldn't identify para prakriti with jiva. A jiva is a manifestation of para prakriti. Para prakriti is like Sri Ramakrishna's Shakti. Okay. According to Aurobindo, then I'm continuing Bala here. According to Aurobindo, Gita's Maya refers to the apara prakriti, the lower prakriti, constituted of the 3 gunas. In fact, Krishna is explicit, chapter 9. Daivi hyesha gunamayi mama maya duratya. Okay. And the cosmic existence is explained by Gita's Prakriti. I really like this point that Bala makes here. It's very subtle. The cosmic existence is explained by Gita's Prakriti, composed of lower and higher, as opposed to Shankara's Maya concept of illusion. So I think Bala gets this just right. And there's a lot going on here. So I suggest, because a couple of you got tripped up on this issue of whether Maya is elusive or not. I think Anthony and a couple other people, Kiran also. Let's look at this. This is page 85. 80, bottom of 84, going into 85. Some of you thought that the concept of Maya in the Gita is a principle of illusion. And that would be inaccurate. But let's look at it carefully. And I can see why some of you are misled about this. It is the method of Shankara. See, I was talking about Shankara here. It is the method of Shankara based upon these concepts of his philosophy. It is the renunciation of life as an illusion of which we ordinarily think when we speak now of the yoga of knowledge. When we think of Jnana Yoga, we think immediately of, usually, most of us, of Shankara's Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, which is based on Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, this world is an illusion. But in the time of the Gita, Maya was evidently not yet quite the master word of the Vedantic philosophy. So Maya didn't even play that prominent a role in Vedantic philosophy. Nor had it, at least with any decisive clearness, the connotation which Shankara brought out of it with such a luminous force and distinctness. This is really important to keep in mind. Which means that, yes, the concept of Maya existed. It wasn't very prominent, but it was there. But what it didn't have was the illusionistic connotation that Shankara school brought to it at a later point. For in the Gita, there is little talk of Maya, which is just true. You do find Maya, but only in a couple verses here and there, out of 700. And much of Prakriti. You find the term Prakriti all over the Gita. And even the former word, meaning Maya, is used as little more than an equivalent of the latter. So Maya is, but only in its inferior status. So when Gita does use the word Maya, it's more or less equated with apara Prakriti, the inferior Prakriti, inferior nature. The three gunas. It is the lower Prakriti of the three gunas, Traigunya Mayi Maya. Then he says, this sentence I think may have misled some of you. Prakriti, not elusive Maya, is in the teaching of the Gita the effective cause of cosmic existence. So when he's contrasting Prakriti of the Gita with elusive Maya, the elusive Maya he's thinking of is not the Gita's Maya, but Shankara's Maya. So that's tricky. I can see why some of you got confused there. In contrast to Shankara's concept of Maya, which is a principle of illusion, the Gita's Prakriti, and I think Bala makes a really nice point here, which is that here the word Prakriti encompasses both the lower apara Prakriti and the para Prakriti, is the effective cause of cosmic existence. How do we know that? Because remember our class last time? How Gita revises and expands upon the Samkhya doctrine. Because according to Samkhya philosophy, what is there? There's only Purusha and Prakriti. And Prakriti is entirely insentient. And it's from Prakriti that everything comes. All these chairs and our bodies, everything comes from this one causal matrix, which is insentient. The Vedanta critique is, how can something insentient be dynamic at all, and how can it lead to all this creation? So it posits a para-prakriti. Gita says, no, it's from para-prakriti that the lower prakriti comes. So it accepts fully that everything comes from apara-prakriti, like Samkhya, but then adds, but where does apara-prakriti come from? Para-prakriti, which is itself one with the divine Purushottama. So here I think Bala's right in thinking that this last sentence, prakriti, means it encompasses both the apara-prakriti and the para-prakriti. Because it has to be Shakti, which is the creator. That's, in that sense, the effective cause of cosmic existence. Shakti is the creator and actually manifests as everything in this world. So the world is a real manifestation of the divine. It's not an illusion. You see what I mean? And Gita can justify that on the basis of its doctrine, the Purushottama, one aspect of which, the dynamic aspect of which is Shakti, or otherwise known as Para-Prakriti, the supreme Prakriti, which manifests as Apara-Prakriti in everything that we see that's insentient, and manifests as each of us as individual souls, which are, of course, conscious and living. Okay? And let's see here. Second study question. This is about Karma Yoga. How does the Gita's... what does Aurobindo mean when he says action is not only a preparation but itself the means of liberation? I think all of you got this right, which is that according to the Gita, through the path of selfless action, you can attain the highest. You can attain liberation. According to Shankara, Karma Yoga is a preparatory discipline for inferior spiritual aspirants who have impure minds. What makes them inferior? They don't have sufficiently pure minds. The purpose of Karma Yoga is to purify the mind, to make one eligible to practice the path of knowledge, which alone leads to liberation. And so all of you more or less got that. But I wanted to flag something. There's an online participant named Shubha. I think it's the same person who's been participating in the past. He feels very strongly about this, and I want to share his dissenting opinion. He disagrees with Sri Aurobindo. He says, Shankara is very emphatic that Karma Yoga of the Bhagavad Gita is only preliminary, preparatory stage which helps in Chitta Shuddhi, purification of mind. And then Karma Yoga is automatically renounced, and the advanced aspirant is then eligible to practice Jnana Yoga, where all actions become impossible, and even actions for bodily maintenance, etc., are due to prarabdha and without any sense of egoism, doership, blah, blah, blah. Then he says, it seems that Gita's Karma Yoga is also saying the same thing. So he thinks that the Gita itself, Krishna agrees with Shankara on this point. Karma Yoga is only indirect, never a direct means, as Shankara wonderfully justified. I don't know why people fallaciously say that Gita prescribes Karma Yoga as a direct means, when they cannot justify Gita 5.6 and 6.3, verses we haven't read yet. Even when asked to do so and carefully avoid these two verses of the Gita, which clearly says, without any doubts, that Karma Yoga is indirect, preparatory, and sannyasa is ultimate and highest. Shankara wonderfully won over everyone over this issue. So he's a strong fan of Shankara's understanding of Karma Yoga, at least. I don't know about on other issues. He thinks that Shankara's view of Karma Yoga as an indirect path to liberation is actually a more accurate interpretation of the Gita's understanding of Karma Yoga than of Sri Aurobindo's reading, which is that the Gita says that Karma Yoga is a direct path. We're not going to talk about verses 5.6 and 6.3 here because we'll wait until we actually get to those verses. But one thing I'll say, Shubha, is that 6.3 I think is the strongest evidence in favor of Shankara. Arurukshod muned yogam. It's a very interesting verse. And it does make this distinction between karma is helpful to people who are still climbing on the path of yoga. But shama, tranquility, is the cause of, is the greatest help for people who have already climbed up the ladder of yoga or whatever. And so it seems, Shankara has a field day with this, says, see, even the Gita itself is distinguishing between two levels of spiritual aspirant, inferior spiritual aspirants who are still climbing up the ladder of yoga, and then the superior ones. But of course, there are multiple interpretations, and Sri Aurobindo will have a different interpretation that's consistent with his understanding of Karma Yoga as a direct path. 5.6 is actually more ambiguous, I would say, Shubha, and it's not as cut and dried as I think you make it out to be. But more importantly, you need to take the Gita as a whole. It has 700 verses. And you have to look carefully at every place where Bhagavan Krishna talks about karma and karma yoga and its role in spiritual life. And one of the verses that is arguably really strong evidence in favor of the Aurobindonian Ramakrishna and Vivekanandan reading of the Gita is Karma neva hi samsiddhim astita janakadeyaha. Through karma eva, through karma alone, King Janaka and others attained perfection. Seems very direct. And it's the eva here is so emphatic that it's through karma that many people have attained perfection directly without mentioning anything about Jnana Yoga or higher or lower spiritual aspirants. And so I think the issue is complicated. I do appreciate your dissenting voice. I think it's really useful to think about. So just keep that in the back of your mind, Shubha's kind of devil's advocate position here. And ask yourself, and try to, just keep an open mind about it and see whether you think that the Gita is supporting the view that Karma Yoga is a direct path or an indirect path to liberation. Third study question. What does the Gita mean by Vedavada? How does it differ from what Sri Aurobindo refers to as the Brahmavada? Why does the Gita criticize Vedavada? I hope we've already covered that. Okay, so we don't really need to focus on that. And even study question 4, what is the central idea of the Vedavada, which the Gita accepts, transfigures, and uplifts? Most of you got this right, which is that yajna, sacrifice. And I've already explained how the Gita broadens and expands it and Vedantizes that concept by making sacrifice include all actions, and secondly, by saying that you have to perform these sacrifices, but taking the ego and desire out of them, out of the performance. But this 5th study question is, I think, the hardest. So I want to focus on that passage, and then I also want to get to some of the questions that you guys had. So, what is Orthodox Vedanta exactly, and how does it relate to, what is the Gita stance toward Orthodox Vedanta? Ellis, I think, gave a nice response to this question, so let me read out his response. A few of you have nice responses, but his is very succinct. Ellis says, according to Sri Aurobindo, the Gita corrects for the one-sidedness of the Orthodox Vedanta of the time by expounding the Purushottama doctrine. At the time, Orthodox Vedanta saw the personal God as ultimately resolving into Nirguna Brahman, or as a lower aspect of Nirguna Brahman. In contrast, the Gita removes the higher-lower distinction between Brahman and the personal God. framing the Purushottama as a higher or rather more comprehensive understanding of ultimate reality. So I think that's a nice overall response to the question. But for more details, I think we need to look at this paragraph carefully. So can we turn to pages 90 to 91 of Essays on the Gita? Okay, what's the context? See, the Gita is inheriting multiple traditions. One is Samkhya, which we already talked about. And then he's talking now specifically in the context of this second part of the structure, Karma Kanda and the Jnana Kanda. He's already explained how the Gita takes the Karma Kanda concept of sacrifice and broadens it and makes it more spiritual. Now he's asking, what does the Gita stands toward Jnana Kanda, the Brahmavada? That's the context of this paragraph. Let's read it carefully. The Vedantic idea of knowledge does not present the same difficulties as the path of karma, the Vedic ritualism. The Gita takes it over at once and completely and throughout the 6 chapters, the first 6 chapters, 1 through 6 of the Gita, quietly substitutes the still immutable Brahman of the Vedantins, the one without a second, immanent in all cosmos, for the still immutable but multiple Purusha of the Sankhyas. Because remember, Sankhyans posit multiple Purushas. And the Gita will say, we accept your idea of the Purusha, except we take it to be a non-dual Purusha. And that is Brahman. That's Nirguna Brahman. Okay, think about this as Nirguna Brahman. That's why still immutable Brahman. Which is one of the keynotes of the Upanishads. If you look at the Upanishads, a lot of them seem to be about Neti Brahman. Upanishads also talk about the theistic God. It uses the term Ishvara a lot. Sometimes Saguna Brahman. But often it's just Brahman and the impersonal Atman. Then he says, it accepts, meaning the Gita, accepts throughout these chapters, these first 6 chapters, knowledge and realization of the Brahman as the most important, the indispensable means of liberation. Even while it insists on desireless works as an essential part of knowledge. If you read the Upanishads, you'll find again and again that what it's teaching is you have to engage in spiritual practices, especially meditation and renunciation, in order to gain knowledge of Brahman. And it's only knowledge of Brahman that liberates you from this cycle of rebirth. Gita will accept that wholesale. No problems with any of that, right? But it insists on desireless works as an essential part of knowledge. Here, with respect, you might ask, is that found in the Upanishads? Is this Karma Yoga doctrine found in the Upanishads? Any guesses as to what, if any of the Upanishads hint at or contain a doctrine of Karma Yoga like we find in the Gita? Anyone?
A little bit, right? In the Ishvara Upanishad?
Isha, is that what you said? Isha Upanishad, exactly. Second mantra, Sri Aurobindo has a field day with it. He has a whole 100-page commentary just on this Isha Upanishad. Kurvan neveha karmani jijivishet shataggasamaha. Living 100 years, one should strive to live 100 years engaging continuously in action, never stopping to act, never ceasing to act in the world. And by doing so in a spiritual way, your actions won't stick to you. It uses the term lipyate, na lipyate nare, karma na lipyate nare. It won't stick to. So arguably, it's this second mantra of the Isha Upanishad, which is the kernel of the Bhagavad Gita's entire doctrine of Karma Yoga. Because of course Gita postdates these ancient Upanishads like Isha Upanishad. Okay, so there are some hints of Karma Yoga. At the same time, it's not at all prominent in most of the Upanishads. And sometimes some of the Upanishads seem to be teaching the opposite, Karma Sannyasa. So Gita, you'll find, is strongly emphasizing Karma Yoga as an equally valid and effective path as Jnana Yoga and Bhakti Yoga and Raja Yoga and these other paths. Okay, let's keep going. The Gita, it accepts equally nirvana of the ego in the infinite equality of the immutable, impersonal Brahman as essential to liberation. It practically identifies this extinction with the Samkhya return of the inactive, immutable Purusha upon itself when it emerges out of identification with the actions of Prakriti. This is one of Aurobindo's famous long sentences with multiple clauses and subclauses. Okay, hold on. So let's pause here first. It accepts this nirvana. See, the term nirvana is used actually in the Gita, surprisingly, to some, because it's a Vedantic scripture. Nirvana is supposed to be a term used in Buddhism, right? And Buddhism predates the Gita. So the Gita is aware of Buddhism and is using this concept of nirvana, except giving it a Vedantic twist. And in fact, there are a number of places in the Gita where Krishna will refer to Brahma Nirvana. Nirvana in Brahman. Dissolution of the individual self in non-dual Brahman. That's what Sri Aurobindo has in mind here. And in later chapters, like chapter 18, Krishna will refer to this realization, this spiritual state, as becoming Brahma Bhuta. Becoming Brahman. Becoming Brahman in this radical kind of Shankarite classical Advaitic sense, like Sri Ramakrishna would say, the salt doll going to measure the depth of the ocean. Once it sets foot in the ocean, it melts into the ocean. Okay, so it's not a strictly Buddhistic understanding of nirvana. It's a Vedantic nirvana of the individual self in the non-dual, impersonal Brahman, the absolute of Shankara's classical Advaita Vedanta. And the Gita accepts it fully. But that's not the highest ideal. Raja Maharaj, the first president of the Ramakrishna order, Swami Brahmananda, he said something which people to this day puzzle over. Nirvikalpa Samadhi is the first stage in spiritual life. Nirvikalpa Samadhi, which is supposed to be the summit of spiritual realization according to classical Advaita, Brahma Jnana, the knowledge of non-dual impersonal Brahman. He says that's the beginning of spiritual life. And then, so you can only explain that, I think, from the standpoint of Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta. After Jnana comes Vijnana. And the Gita, according to Sri Aurobindo, has the same kind of idea. So you become one with Brahman, and then you have to become a Vijnani. And the higher state is Supreme Bhakti, Para Bhakti, all taught in chapter 18. And Sri Aurobindo gives a really virtuosic interpretation of those verses in chapter 18 of the Gita. That's kind of two stages, Jnana and Vijnana. This is the Brahma Bhuta stage, becoming one with the non-dual Brahman, which the Gita accepts, but not as a final goal. Okay. The Gita combines and fuses the language of the Vedanta with the language of the Samkhya, as had already indeed been done by certain of the Upanishads. Even some of the Upanishads, like the Shvetashvata Upanishad, he says it in the footnote, uses some of the language of Samkhya, the three gunas and other things, even the term Samkhya, Purusha, Prakriti. Now, Sri Aurobindo says, but still there is a defect in the Vedantic position which has to be overcome. This is the orthodox Vedantic position, the kind of popular Vedanta of the time of the Gita. What exactly is that? It's a little mysterious. It's complicated because anytime there's a historical question about what Vedantic doctrine existed in the time of the Gita, first of all, we don't know exactly when the Gita was composed. We don't have good historical records for these things, so it's all speculative. But let's see what Sri Aurobindo's understanding is. And see how cagey he is. We may perhaps conjecture. So see how it's all he's not making very absolute statements. This is his own speculative conjecture. That at this time, the Vedanta had not yet redeveloped the later theistic tendencies, which in the Upanishads are already present as an element, but not so prominent as in the Vaishnava philosophies of the later Vedantins, where they become indeed not only prominent, but paramount. What is he saying in this, again, this classically Aurobindonian sentence? He's saying that Orthodox Vedanta in the time of the Gita did have theistic elements, but they didn't emphasize the theistic side so much, the personal God so much. That becomes a very prominent element in the later Bhakti schools of Vedanta, especially the Vaishnava schools like Chaitanya school and Vallabha school of Shuddhadvaita, where Krishna is the be-all and end-all. In the Upanishads, yes, there is mention of the personal God, but it's kind of subdued. Okay, then he says,
Swami, why does he say redeveloped? Suggesting that it was there before?
Yeah.
It confuses me.
I think redeveloped from the Upanishads themselves. And also, I mean, he gives a really interesting reading of the Vedas, the ancient Vedic hymns. He has a whole book called The Secret of the Vedas. And there, he says that it's a mistake to think that what these ancient Vedic hymns are about are just these literal sacrifices. In fact, there's an exoteric and an esoteric meaning behind these Vedic rituals. And the Purva Mimamsa school of philosophy takes them literally. They become the Vedic fundamentalist school, taking them to be, you literally sacrifice this animal and you get these worldly enjoyments. Sri Aurobindo says every single item in these sacrifices, every word in these Vedic hymns has a spiritual and symbolic and mystical significance. And he goes and tries to explain the mystical significance of it. So it's also possible that he's thinking of the ancient Vedas that predate the Upanishads themselves. Even the Karma Kanda, the so-called Karma Kanda, has a deep spiritual and mystical element which also accepts the personal God. So I wonder whether that's also an aspect of it. So that's a good question. We may take it that the orthodox Vedanta was, at any rate in its main tendencies, pantheistic at the basis, monistic at the summit. Pantheism means this world is God. And monistic at the summit, he gives a footnote saying monism here is that God or Brahman alone exists and the cosmos is only an illusory appearance or else a real but partial manifestation. Illusory appearance, he's clearly thinking of Shankara here. But, as Vikas rightly points out, he's an online participant, he says, wait a minute, but Shankara postdates the Gītā. So Gītā can't be thinking of Shankara's school. That's right. I think what Sri Aurobindo is saying is that even in the Gītā's own time, which predates Shankara by several centuries, there was already a school of Vedanta which was moving in an illusionistic direction. We already find that in Gaudapada, who was traditionally considered to be the guru of Shankara, who was strongly influenced by, he wrote Mandukya Karika, very illusionistic kind of Advaita Vedanta, influenced by Buddhism. And specifically Yogacara Buddhism and the Buddhism of Nagarjuna, so Madhyamaka Buddhism. And Yogacara Buddhism taught that this world is a dream. It has no more reality than the dream state. Okay. And so that means that these illusionistic currents were already present in the Gītā's time, because that's one sub-school of Buddhism, Yogacara Buddhism, which denies the ultimate reality of this world. And Advaita itself, Vedanta itself was influenced, at least some aspects of Vedanta were influenced by the illusionistic streams, thought currents of that time. So I think that's what he's thinking of, is that Orthodox Vedanta does accept a personal God, but it's subdued. The emphasis more, it's primarily on the impersonal, and then, I'm not going to keep reading, but, or maybe let me skip a little bit. Okay, so he says, it knew of the Brahman, one without a second. It knew of the gods, Vishnu, Shiva, Brahma, and the rest, who all resolved themselves into the Brahman. But the one supreme Brahman as the one Ishvara Purusha Deva, words often applied to it in the Upanishads and justifying to that extent, yet passing beyond the Samkhya and the theistic conceptions, was an idea that had fallen from its pride of place. The names could only be applied in a strictly logical Brahmavada to subordinate or inferior phases of the Brahman idea. So in this Orthodox Vedanta of the time of the Gītā, there is mention of the personal God Saguna Brahman, but it's considered to be somehow inferior to, or just an aspect of, the impersonal absolute. Okay? So it's moving in the direction of Shankara, but not quite there yet. And there are some aspects of the Orthodox Vedanta which are already illusionistic, but that doesn't mean that Orthodox Vedanta itself was strictly illusionistic. That comes later. In fact, Shankara in some of his commentaries talks about a school of Vedanta which predates his own. And it's a Bheda Vedanta taught by Bhartri Prapancha. And it's a realist school. So actually, the more, especially now, if we're talking about now, the scholarship comes down on... Most modern scholars will say that the Vedanta that preceded Shankara's school was a realist school, and that they didn't dismiss this world as an illusion. So that's why he's so speculative, and he says it's a conjecture and all that. We may perhaps conjecture because, with more historical research, we might have better clues into what kind of Vedanta was taught in the time of the Gītā. Finally, this chapter culminates in this idea of the Purushottama. The Gītā introduces in chapter 15 the idea of a Purushottama, which is equally personal and impersonal, and is higher even than the Akshara Brahman, the impersonal Brahman, the impersonal absolute. And because of that, it accepts both the Saguna and Nirguna Brahman of Orthodox Vedanta, but doesn't have a higher and lower in that sense. But some people raise this interesting question of, well, there still seems to be a language of higher and lower, because in chapter 15, Krishna says, I am higher, greater, Uttama Purusha. I am greater even than the Akshara Brahman, the Nirguna Brahman. And so the Vaishnava schools, especially ISKCON and the Chaitanya school, they have a field day with that language and say that, see, there's a hierarchy there too. Our beloved Krishna is higher than your classical Advaitic Nirguna Brahman. But Sri Aurobindo has a more liberal and non-hierarchical way of interpreting it. And I think Ellis nicely, you take the term higher here, Uttama. The term Uttama really literally does mean higher, but you suggest that you say a higher or rather more comprehensive understanding of ultimate reality. I think that's actually truer to the spirit of Sri Aurobindo, Ramakrishna, and Vivekananda. It's higher in this sense of more expansive or comprehensive. It's a broader conception of the ultimate reality, but one that avoids this language, this hierarchical language of higher and lower.
Doesn't the hierarchy also have to do with developing towards that Purushottama, the awareness developing towards? It has to grow. Your understanding has to grow from Brahman to Purushottama.
Yeah, well, that's why Sri
So
Aurobindo
it's
says.
one idea, but you haven't
Yeah.
realized it yet.
Yeah, that's why Sri Ramakrishna calls it a stage, right? It's jnana to vijnana. Most people have to pass through. And vijnana is already, I mean, it's a very, very high stage. Jnana is very high. But sometimes it's useful to go through, first, like, think about Brahman as impersonal, and then you can go on to this more expansive understanding of Purushottama as impersonal and personal. So, there are quite a few questions, and we don't have much time. Let me see here. So, Vikas asks, how does, this is online participant, how does chapter 8's Akshara Brahma fit into the framework as explained by you earlier, meaning this one, the chart from last time? Is it Purushottama, Nirguna Brahman, or Saguna Brahman? My guess is that it is the Nirguna Brahman. So, we'll talk about this in detail when we talk about chapter 8. But Akshara Brahman is a term used also in chapter 15 and chapter 12. I take Sri Aurobindo to interpret Akshara Brahman consistently as the Nirguna Brahman of classical Advaita Vedanta, basically. The impersonal absolute. Satyam, and actually somebody else, Gītā Stevens, both online participants, had a similar question. They ask, what exactly does Sri Aurobindo mean when he uses the term analytical versus synthetic? Because they looked it up online, but they didn't find an adequate definition of it in the context of Essays on the Gita. So let me read you a passage. This is from Essays on the Gita, pages 68 to 69. Sri Aurobindo says, again, its yoga, the Gita's yoga, is founded upon the analytical philosophy of the Sankhyas. Samkhya literally means enumeration. Analysis in the sense of analysis. Lysis in Latin, it means breaking down, breaking things down into its different elements or parts. Okay. But still, the Gita proceeds far beyond it, negatives even some of its characteristic tendencies, and finds a means of reconciling the lower analytical knowledge of Samkhya with the higher synthetic and Vedantic truth. So synthesis is the opposite of analysis here. Instead of breaking things down, it's constructive and reconciling and harmonizing. It tries to bring things together. That's what synthetic means as an adjective. Synthesis is the noun form.
As opposed to synthetic,
Analysis.
like artificial.
Yeah. People look it up and say, what are synthetic fabrics and, all sorts
Yeah.
of, or chemical and stuff like that. Anthony says, Sri Aurobindo's commentary and interpretation of the Gita derives from the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna and tracks those of Swami Vivekananda. Why did it take so long for this particular synthesis to be realized? It's a good question. But first of all, you should keep in mind that Sri Aurobindo wrote this commentary over 100 years ago, 1916 to 1920. But what I find more interesting is that most people don't realize that he has interpreted the Gita from the standpoint of Ramakrishna and Vivekananda. They think he's just belongs to his own he has his own ashrama and it's his own Aurobindonian interpretation. Because you have to read a little between the lines. He doesn't explicitly talk about Ramakrishna anywhere. Do you see what I mean? So it's only people with extensive background in Ramakrishna and who are able to understand Sri Aurobindo's formidably difficult English and who have some understanding of the Gita, who can really put this stuff together. So I'm one of the first scholars to really make a strong case that Sri Aurobindo's whole Vedantic philosophy and his interpretation of the Vedantic scriptures, and especially the Gita, were strongly influenced by Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. And if part of your question is also like, why don't monks of our order emphasize it so much? That's a good $1 million question, which I think partly because in training center we're taught the scriptures using Shankara's commentaries. And so we're taught to think that the orthodoxy is Shankara's school, and we're not really encouraged to think creatively outside that Shankara box. So Essays on Gita, it's a hidden treasure for our tradition, I think.
How did the Shankara box come about in our tradition?
I think just because he's tremendously prestigious in India, culturally, spiritually, intellectually. If you think Vedanta, it's usually Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, especially in a monastic context. The Darshanami Sampradaya of Shankara's tradition is extraordinarily influential and important. So, and there are these ready-made commentaries available for us. Who has written commentaries from the standpoint of Ramakrishna? Nobody yet, really. Chidbhavananda has tried. So we don't have them. And almost nobody thinks of Sri Aurobindo as somebody belonging to our lineage, so they're not going to use Sri Aurobindo's commentary. And the English is way too hard for most people, especially whose mother tongue is not English. I think it has to do with practical issues, and also we're a fledgling order back in the turn of the 20th century, right? The wisest thing you can do from a practical standpoint is to align yourself with the most prestigious spiritual tradition out there. That's you piggyback. So it's a borrowed glory. You know, automatically you align yourself with the Darshanami Sampradaya. You get all the perks of that, of being part of that tradition. Rahul asks, another online participant, I am confused about one aspect of the Gita's teachings. In 2.45, Krishna says the Vedas deal with the three gunas. Rise above them, Arjuna. We haven't read that yet, but we'll read that. Then he says, I thought that karma yoga, when done without attachment to the fruits of action, is still a sattvika activity. How could it be described as transcending the three gunas? Don't all spiritual acts, even viveka and vichara, discrimination, still fall within the confines of the three gunas? It's a good question, especially from the standpoint of spiritual practice. Any answers? How would you answer this question? Sri Ramakrishna himself says, yes, things like bhakti, dispassion, detachment, renunciation, compassion, all these things are sattvic.
They point to where you're supposed to go, but then you leave it behind.
Exactly, because he has the story of the three robbers. The sattva robber will untie you, point you in the right direction, but then that gentleman says, why don't you come with me, O sattva? So I can't, where you're going, I can't go with you. So become sattvic. That's the priority in spiritual life. God realization is too high a goal, so the proximate goal should always be, as spiritual aspirants, how do we become as sattvic as possible? We do it through engaging in spiritual practices and trying to become less egoistic, less selfish, and so on and so forth. Once we become very sattvic, what happens? The mind itself becomes guru, and that sattva itself will lead us beyond the three gunas. The highest goal is transcending the three gunas. You can only reach that highest goal by becoming sattvic. You cannot get a PhD until you've done a bachelor's and a master's. That's the idea. So as spiritual aspirants, it's very important not to skip steps. Any questions from people sitting here now? Otherwise, I can address one or two more questions from the online audience. Rahul.
But in that verse of the Gita, he says, I think also that the Karmakanda of the Vedas deal with the three gunas. So then why should one ignore them or demote them to a lower status if they're getting you sattva anyway?
No, so you have to be careful. Here, the three gunas, he's saying that the three gunas in the sense of this lower prakriti. Everything in this world is composed of these three gunas. It's basically, in Tapasyananda explains it in this way. The karma kanda, the ritualistic portion of the Vedas, is concerned with worldly things, with the things of this world, literal sacrifices, with the aim of what? Worldly enjoyments, in that sense. And it never goes beyond the domain of the three gunas in that sense. It doesn't even teach things like selflessness and compassion and bhakti. It doesn't believe in a personal God, actually.
Okay.
Do you see what I mean?
So more Rajasic, you mean?
It's very Rajasic, yeah. That's, if you were to categorize it in terms of three gunas, I would say it falls under Rajas. Why? Because it tells you to engage in activities. So it's definitely not tamasic. It's not telling you to be lazy or do nothing. No, perform all these Vedic sacrifices exactly as specified in these scriptures. And what will you get? You'll be able to fulfill all of your desires. Wonderful, right? That's Rajasic. Yeah, exactly. Any other questions? Vikas asks, I'll just read a couple other questions of his. So, Kevala Dvaita, or one more question. Kevala Dvaita disagrees with Jnana Karma Samuchaya. So he's using technical terms, the Sanskrit terms. Kevala Dvaita means Shankara's classical Advaita Vedanta. Shankara's school disagrees with Jnana Karma Samuchaya, which literally means the simultaneous practice of Jnana Yoga and Karma Yoga. Okay, he's right to say that. Shankara's school disagrees with that. So does the integration of works and knowledge, he's quoting from Sri Aurobindo's essays on the Gita here, of the Gita align itself to an interpretation which accepts Jnana Karma Samuchaya? So it takes some background in Vedanta here to understand the question. One of the main targets of Shankara was Jnana Karma Samuchaya, because there were certain schools at the time which were encouraging us to practice Jnana Yoga and Karma Yoga at the same time. The same person at the same time can practice both Karma Yoga and Jnana Yoga, and that is actually spiritually beneficial. He says, no way, because Karma Yoga is meant for a lower level of spiritual aspirant, and Jnana Yoga is meant for a superior spiritual aspirant. But the same person at the same time cannot practice both. The same person at different times might. I might have an impure mind, then practice Karma Yoga for 40 years, and then graduate to the level of being a superior spiritual aspirant. Then I can practice Jnana Yoga. But the same person at the same time should not and cannot practice both Karma Yoga and Jnana Yoga. So Vikas is asking, well, what is the Gita's stance on this? Does it accept Jnana Karma Samuchaya? I think yes. Ramanuja's school, for instance, does accept Jnana Karma Samuchaya. You can. The same person can practice Karma Yoga and Jnana Yoga at the same time. I think the Gita's view is also, you can be a Karma Yogi and you can be a Jnana Yogi. And in fact, one of the main points of the first part of this chapter 9, Arjuna's puzzlement regarding Sankhya and Yoga, Sri Aurobindo says what the Gita does in a very subtle way is show that Karma Yoga incorporates elements from Sankhya. You see. And Sankhya itself has, the Karma Yoga itself has this idea of ourselves as the non-doer. If you're doing Karma Yoga properly, at the highest stage of Karma Yoga, what happens? You lose the sense of doership altogether. Sri Ramakrishna says, how does he define the Jivan Mukta, the one who is liberated while still in the physical body? As the one who knows that he or she is not the doer, but that God alone is the doer. So there's a kind of Sankhya element. Of course, God alone is the doer is not in Sankhya. That's the Vedantic Sankhya of the Gita. But the idea that Prakriti is doing everything, body, mind is all on the side of Prakriti. And then Gita will add the Vedantic element but what's fueling that Prakriti? Paraprakriti, Divine Mother, Shakti. So ultimately we're just instruments in the hands of Divine Mother. That's the idea. Okay, great. Thanks, guys. And I'll just reiterate the assignment for those of you who came slightly late. Next class, Sunday, 26th May, 9:30 a.m. The next assignment is to read chapter 10 of Essays on the Gita, the Yoga of the Intelligent Will, and verses 40 to 72 of chapter 2 of Bhagavad Gita. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.